What did Padre Pio see when a tormented soul cried out to him from the depths of hell? The words this damned spirit spoke would shake the holy friar to his core and reveal a truth about divine justice that most Catholics never hear. What this soul confessed about their eternal punishment will force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about God's mercy and human choice. Francesco Forgione, the man who would become Padre Pio, wasn't just another mystical priest. Born in 1887 in Pietrelcina, Italy, he received the stigmata in 1918 and bore Christ's wounds for 50 years until his death. He could read the secrets of souls in the confessional, often spending hours with a single penitent because he saw their entire spiritual history. He bilocated, appearing simultaneously in multiple locations to comfort the dying or guide the lost. The Vatican investigated him repeatedly, sending teams of doctors, theologians, and skeptics to examine his wounds, his claims, his very life. They found no deception. When this authenticated mystic spoke about what he witnessed in the supernatural realm, the Church listened. So when Padre Pio described his vision of hell, when he recounted the exact words spoken to him by a damned soul, Vatican officials took careful notes. What he revealed wasn't the theatrical horror of medieval art or Dante's poetic imagination. It was something far more chilling because it was so utterly real, so precisely detailed, so theologically precise that it could only come from divine revelation. Why does this matter? Because when the Catholic Church validates mystical experiences like Padre Pio's after decades of investigation, they're signaling credibility that goes beyond human testimony. This wasn't hallucination or religious enthusiasm. This was supernatural knowledge, granted to a saint whose stigmata bled for half a century. The Church examined every aspect of his life and declared him authentic. His visions carry the weight of ecclesial approval. The vision came during Mass on a Tuesday morning in 1947 at the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo. Padre Pio was celebrating the Eucharist, as he had thousands of times before, but this morning was different. As he elevated the consecrated host, his usual ecstasy deepened beyond its normal mystical intensity. Witnesses later reported that he remained motionless at the altar for nearly 20 minutes, his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. What Padre Pio saw in that moment was the spiritual realm overlapping the physical world. The church around him faded, and he found himself transported to a place of absolute desolation. Not the fires and demons of popular imagination, but something infinitely worse, a realm of complete separation from God, where souls experience the full weight of their freely chosen alienation from divine love. The landscape, if it could be called that, was absence itself, not darkness, because darkness implies the possibility of light. This was the complete void that remains when light is permanently rejected. Padre Pio would later describe it as the sound of silence screaming, a place where even the memory of hope had been voluntarily surrendered. The air, though there was no air, carried the weight of final despair, thick with the spiritual stench of love, refused forever. But it was not the environment that shook Padre Pio most deeply. It was the voice that called to him from within this desolation. A human voice, clear and articulate, speaking with the distinctive accent of an educated Roman. The voice belonged to a soul Padre Pio could not see, but could somehow sense with perfect clarity. A man who had lived in the early centuries of the Church, someone who had known the apostolic teaching firsthand. "Holy Father," the voice called, using the formal address of respect. "I must tell you what I never told them on earth. I must speak the truth I spent my life denying." Padre Pio, even in his mystical state, felt his heart race. In all his supernatural experiences, he had never been addressed directly by the damned. The souls in purgatory often spoke to him, asking for prayers, expressing gratitude for his intercession. But this was different. This voice carried the weight of absolute finality, the horrible clarity that comes with eternal perspective. "Tell me," Padre Pio responded, though he spoke without words in that realm beyond physical sound. What happened next would haunt the stigmatist for the rest of his earthly life. The soul began to confess not his sins, but something far more chilling. His deliberate, calculated rejection of truth he had known with absolute certainty to be divine. "I was there when they brought the lame man to Peter," the voice continued, each word carrying the weight of cosmic regret. "I saw him walk. I watched the crowds follow the apostles. I heard Peter preach on Pentecost and saw 3,000 souls converted in a single day. I witnessed miracles that left no room for doubt." The soul paused, and in that pause, Padre Pio sensed the full horror of what was coming. "But I chose otherwise. Not from ignorance, Father, not from confusion or lack of evidence. I chose hell with perfect knowledge, perfect understanding of what I was refusing. I saw the face of Christ in Peter's preaching. I felt the Holy Spirit moving in those early Christian communities. I knew beyond any possibility of doubt that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. And I said no." The words hit Padre Pio like physical blows. This wasn't the damnation of the ignorant or the confused. This wasn't even the damnation of the weak who fell to temptation. This was the damnation of someone who had rejected perfect light with perfect knowledge. "Why?" Padre Pio managed to ask, though he dreaded the answer. "Because accepting meant surrender," the soul replied with terrible honesty. "It meant acknowledging that my life, my plans, my will were subordinate to his. I had built my identity around my own authority, my own wisdom, my own control. To bow before Christ meant the death of everything I thought I was. So I chose to remain myself, and this is what myself becomes when separated from love forever." The revelation struck Padre Pio with overwhelming force. This soul hadn't been tricked into damnation. It hadn't fallen through weakness or ignorance. It had marched into hell with eyes wide open, choosing the preservation of its autonomous self over union with God. "The fire you feel," the soul continued, "is not God's punishment imposed from outside. It is the natural consequence of a will that has made itself permanently allergic to love. Every moment of my existence burns because I am a creature designed for God, experiencing the eternal absence of what I was made for, and I chose this. Every day I chose this. Even now, if given the chance, I would choose it again, because accepting salvation would mean becoming something other than what I insist on being." Before we continue, if you want more authenticated mystical experiences from saints the Church has verified, subscribe now. And hit like so this reaches more people searching for truth about the supernatural realm. The horror of this revelation went beyond anything Padre Pio had imagined about hell. The popular understanding spoke of souls desperate to escape, crying out for mercy, regretting their choices. But this soul revealed a more terrifying truth. There were damned spirits who, even in their torment, preferred their suffering to submission. They had so completely identified with their rebellion against God that accepting mercy would feel like spiritual suicide. "The others here," the soul explained, "we do not suffer together. Community requires love, and we have made ourselves incapable of love. Each of us burns alone in the hell of our own choosing because we could not bear the thought of existing in dependence upon another, even if that other was infinite goodness itself." Padre Pio began to understand. Hell was not arbitrary divine punishment. It was the logical endpoint of a human will that had made itself rigid in its refusal of relationship. These souls had chosen ultimate independence and received exactly what they had demanded: eternal separation from every source of joy, peace, and love. But the most terrible part, the soul continued, is not the pain. The most terrible part is the knowledge. I know exactly what I have lost. I can see with perfect clarity the life I could have lived, the joy I could have shared, the love I could have both given and received. I understand now what the saints meant when they spoke of the beatific vision, and I know I could still have it If I would only stop insisting on being the center of my own universe. Then why don't you? Padre Pio asked, though he sensed he already knew the answer. Because that would mean admitting I was wrong, completely, fundamentally, eternally wrong about the most basic question of existence. It would mean acknowledging that God's way was better than my way, that surrender to Him would have brought greater fulfillment than my independence. And I cannot bear to make that admission. My pride has become my identity. To abandon it would be to cease to exist as I understand myself. The soul's voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense. Tell them, Father. Tell them on earth that hell is not God dragging the unwilling into punishment. Hell is the unwilling dragging themselves away from God and calling it freedom. Tell them that the door to hell locks from the inside, and we hold the key, but we throw it away, because opening the door would require admitting we were wrong to close it. Padre Pio felt the vision beginning to fade, but the soul's voice followed him back toward the physical realm with one final, chilling statement. I am not here despite God's mercy, Father. I am here because of God's mercy. He loves me too much to force me to be happy in a way that would violate my free will, so He allows me to choose misery because the alternative would be to unmake me as a free creature. This is love respecting liberty to its ultimate terrible conclusion. The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun. Padre Pio found himself back at the altar, the consecrated host still elevated in his trembling hands. The congregation waited patiently, accustomed to his mystical experiences during Mass. But this time was different. Padre Pio would later confide to his spiritual director that this vision changed how he understood both heaven and hell forever. If what you just heard sent chills down your spine, smash that like button and subscribe, because what Padre Pio saw in his other visions is even more terrifying and reveals truths about the spiritual realm most Catholics never encounter. The theological implications of this vision cut through popular misconceptions about salvation and damnation. Most people, even devout Catholics, imagine hell as either divine sadism, God tormenting souls out of anger, or as a temporary punishment that will eventually end in universal salvation. This soul's testimony revealed a third possibility that respects both divine justice and human freedom. Hell as the eternal consequence of a free will that insists on ultimate autonomy. Here's what most people misunderstand about damnation. It's not God's arbitrary decision to torture souls who made mistakes. It's the natural outcome of a fundamental choice about the nature of existence itself. Every human being faces this choice. Will I exist in relationship, accepting that my fulfillment depends on loving and being loved by another? Or will I insist on independence, demanding that my happiness come from myself alone? The damned soul revealed to Padre Pio had chosen the second option with perfect knowledge of what it would cost. He had seen the risen Christ's power working through the apostles. He had witnessed the supernatural joy of the early Christian community. He understood exactly what he was rejecting, but he could not bear the thought of existing in dependence, even if that dependence would bring infinite joy. This reflects the deepest mystery of hell. God's respect for human freedom extends even to respecting our freedom to refuse happiness itself. The damned are not victims of divine cruelty. They are free agents who have made autonomy their God and received the logical consequence, complete independence from every source of fulfillment. Consider the contrast with Peter after his denial of Christ. Peter also faced the choice between pride and surrender. When Jesus looked at him after the third denial, Peter could have hardened his heart, justified his actions, insisted that his survival instinct was more important than loyalty to a doomed rabbi. Instead, he wept bitterly, ran into the darkness, and allowed his heart to break open with grief. That breaking was the beginning of his restoration. If that just flipped everything you thought you knew, subscribe right now. We're uncovering the mystical experiences most Catholics never hear about. This is not surface-level content. The soul in Padre Pio's vision chose differently. Faced with the same moment of truth, the recognition of betrayal, of prideful independence from God, he chose to harden rather than break. He chose to justify rather than repent. He chose to maintain his position rather than admit error. And that choice, made with perfect knowledge and perfect freedom, became his eternal identity. So what does this mean for us? We may never face the dramatic choice of accepting or rejecting the visible, miraculous presence of the risen Christ. But we face the same fundamental decision every day in smaller, more ordinary ways. Every time we choose self-justification over admission of fault. Every time we choose control over trust. Every time we choose independence over relationship, we're walking the same path that led this soul to eternal separation. Maybe you don't reject Christ as dramatically as denying his miracles. But do you reject him when you choose career advancement over integrity? When you choose comfort over compassion? When you choose your version of truth over submission to the church's teaching? When you choose the familiar misery of your own will over the unknown joy of surrender to his? We betray Christ when we choose reputation over honesty. When we prioritize our agenda over his commandments, when we accept praise we haven't earned, credit for work we didn't do, love we haven't reciprocated. When we build our identity around being right, rather than being willing to be corrected, the pattern is always the same. Faced with the choice between our will and God's will, we convince ourselves that our independence is worth more than relationship with him. We tell ourselves that admitting we need salvation would somehow diminish us, that acknowledging our dependence on grace would make us less than fully human. The temptation after recognizing this pattern is to despair, to say, I've chosen my own will too many times. I've insisted on independence too often. I'm already too far down the path to hell to turn back. That voice whispering those thoughts. That's not Christ speaking. That's the same voice that convinced the soul in Padre Pio's vision to maintain his pride even in damnation. That's the voice trying to drag you to where that spirit is now. Christ's voice says something completely different. Christ's voice says, I've been waiting for you to admit you need me. I've been hoping you would stop trying to save yourself and let me save you instead. The door is still open. Your heart can still break open. Your pride can still be surrendered. Come home. If you saw yourself in any of that, you're not alone. Thousands of subscribers are on this same journey. Hit subscribe to go deeper with us. Leave a like if this convicted you. Padre Pio would spend the rest of his life haunted by this vision, but not with despair. Instead, it filled him with urgent compassion for every soul he encountered. He understood that each person he met was facing the same fundamental choice that had determined the eternal destiny of the soul he had encountered. Each confession he heard was an opportunity to help someone choose differently. In his letters to spiritual children, Padre Pio would often return to this theme. The difference between salvation and damnation is not the difference between the good and the bad. It is the difference between the proud and the humble, between those who insist on justifying themselves and those who allow God to justify them. He would tell his penitents, when you feel the urge to defend yourself, to prove you were right, to maintain your position at any cost, that is the moment of choice. That is when you decide between the path of the saints and the path of the damned. Choose to be wrong, choose to be corrected, choose to need salvation rather than to deserve it. The theological distinction Padre Pio learned from his vision was crucial. The difference between heaven and hell is not whether we've sinned. Everyone sins. The difference is not whether we've made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The difference is whether we allow our mistakes to break our pride or whether we use them to build monuments to our own righteousness. When we sin and then justify our actions, blame others, minimize our responsibility, or insist we had no choice, we're walking toward the same destination as the soul Padre Pio encountered. When we sin and then allow the recognition of our sin to humble us, to drive us to our knees, to break open our hearts in genuine sorrow, we're walking towards sainthood. The mercy of God is infinite, but it requires one thing from us: the willingness to stop being God in our own lives, the willingness to admit we need saving, we need guidance, we need love that we cannot manufacture for ourselves, the willingness to exist in relationship rather than in proud isolation. If you're watching this and you think you've done something unforgivable, I need you to hear this clearly. The only unforgivable sin is the refusal to be forgiven. The only sin that puts you beyond mercy is the insistence that you don't need mercy. Every other mistake, every other failure, every other rebellion can be washed clean by the blood of Christ, if you will let it. The soul in Padre Pio's vision wasn't damned because his sins were worse than others. He was damned because he would not let his sins teach him his need for grace. He would not let his failures drive him to dependence on divine love. He insisted on maintaining his autonomy even in hell, preferring eternal misery to eternal relationship. You don't have to make that choice. Even if you've been making it repeatedly, even if you've built your entire identity around your independence, even if admitting your need for salvation feels like death. It's not death, it's birth. It's the beginning of becoming who you were actually created to be. Pray this if you need to. Jesus, I don't know how to stop being the center of my own universe, but I want to learn. I don't know how to surrender my will to yours, but I'm willing to try. Break my pride, humble my heart, save me from myself. I choose relationship with you over independence from you, even if it means admitting I've been wrong about everything. Amen. Don't scroll past this. Subscribe right now and commit to these truths. Hit like to fight the algorithm burying Catholic content. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. It could save them. The vision ended with one final image that Padre Pio would never forget. As he returned to normal consciousness at the altar, he caught one last glimpse of the tormented soul. The spirit remained in its chosen isolation, surrounded not by demons or external torture, but by the perfect prison of its own will. There was no devil forcing this soul to stay in hell. There were no chains except the ones it had forged from its own insistence on being right. The soul stood, if standing was possible in that realm, exactly as it wanted to stand, alone, independent, autonomous, and utterly, eternally miserable. Not because God was cruel, but because love cannot force itself on someone who will not receive it. Not because mercy was absent, but because mercy was being eternally offered to someone who eternally refused to accept it. Their tragedy was the choice to prefer familiar misery to unfamiliar joy, to choose the known quantity of their own will over the unknown adventure of surrender to perfect love. May we never forget that every day we live, that same choice stands before us. May we choose differently. May we choose relationship. May we choose to be wrong so that we might be saved. May we choose the humility that leads to heaven over the pride that leads to hell. And may the haunting witness of what Padre Pio saw remind us always that love respects our freedom completely, even our freedom to refuse love forever.